This week's Parsha is Parshas Bamidbar, and Parshas Bamidbar we have none of the Taryag mitzvahs. So every year in this Parsha, just go through the Parsha and look for some interesting sugya to speak about. And today we will speak about an extremely fascinating sugya, which is part of Hilchos Pidyon HaBen. Shlichus bePidyon HaBen. Could a father redeem his son and perform the mitzvah Pidyon HaBen and the Shliach? But first, what does that have to do with this parsha? So let's read part of Parshas Bamidbar. V'yedaber Hashem el Moshe b'koid kol b'chor zochor b'nei Yisrael b'ben chodesh v'mala v'soas mispar shemoisam, count all the b'chorim. V'lokachtu as alavim li ani Hashem tachas kol b'chor b'bnei Yisrael v'zbehemes alavim tachas kol b'chor b'behemes b'nei Yisrael. And that is what Moshe did. V'yifkid Moshe kashet tzivo Hashem Moshe kol b'chor b'bnei Yisrael v'yikol b'chor zochor b'mispar shemes b'ben chodesh v'mala lefkudeim shnayim v'yesem elef shloisha v'shivim u'mesayim. So there were 22,273 b'chorim. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu told Moshe, count all the Leviim. And there were exactly 22,000 Leviim. So a Levi stands in place of the Bechor. One Bechor, one Levi. The Bechorim are out, the Leviim are in. But then we're left with 273 Bechorim. Each of them gave 5 shkolim. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, you take that money and give it la'aharon u'lebonav. So this was the very first form of Pidyon HaBen. It's not the classical Pidyon. It's not the fathers of those Bechorim. And throughout the ages, a Levi doesn't stand in instead of a Bechor. But it is interesting to realize that there are 5 sugyas in Pidyon HaBen which are derived and learned after from this parsha. So the mitzvah of Pidyon HaBen is found 3 times in Torah's Moshe. But it is only from this parsha that we know that the money goes to Zichrei Kahuna. And that is what the Rambam explains. Perek Aleph Halacha Yud Hilchos Bikurim V'Shah Matnas Kodesh B'Gvulin. It is only from the mitzvah that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, V'lokachtu chameshes shkolim legelgoles, V'notatu hakesef la'aharon u'levonov peduyehu oidfem bohem. It is from this person that we learn Zichrei Kahuna are entitled to get the 5 shkolim of Pidyon HaBen. That's number 1. Number 2, Shalas Teshuvah Tzemach Tzedek. There are 2 svarim named Shalas Teshuvah Tzemach Tzedek. One is from the second Lubavitcher Rebbe, who was one of the sages of his generation. But 300 years earlier, less than 300 years, 350 years ago, the first Tzemach Tzedek was composed. His name was also Menachem Mendel. Rabbi Menachem Mendel Krochmila was a Talmud of the Bach. Shalas Teshuvah Tzemach Tzedek, Siman Kuf Chav Ches, he was asked. A baby was born, the baby was ill. We could not perform Mila. He still is an Odel. Do we wait with the Pidyon? Or we do Pidyon HaBen when he becomes 30 days old, regardless of whether he is circumcised or not? And the Tzemach Tzedek says, Mila is not me'akev Pidyon HaBen. There's no reason to wait. The very first Pidyon HaBen was before Mitzvahs Mila. And that is the Pidyon HaBen of the Bechorim and the Leviim in Midbar. That's halacha number 2. Halacha number 3 in B'choris Nun Aleph we learn. Father needs to give 5 shkulim for Pidyon HaBen. But he doesn't necessarily need to give those 5 shkulim to one kohen. He can split up between 10 kohanim. Meshech Chochma, in our parsha, Parshas Bamidbar, Rameh Simchas Masbar, how do we know this halacha? From the story I just learned with you. So there were 273 Bechorim, more than Leviim. Each of them gave 5 shkulim. And then HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe, V'nasatu asa kesef la'aron u'lebonov. The Medrash says, Aaron Abonov. You split the money. Some of it Aaron gets, some of it his children get. It is from here that we learn. You could split the money and you don't need to give it all to one kohen. Halacha number 4, and that's the main topic we will be discussing soon. The Ramah Shin Hey Seafood writes, there is no shlichus by Pidyon HaBen. The father needs to do it himself. Most of the Achronim disagree, as we will see in a few minutes. Rabbi Yehuda Asad, Sharas Shechuvas Rabbi Yehuda Asad, Yoredei Arei Samachay says, it is from this story that we know shlichus is relevant. Because HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu, you take the money from the B'chorim, you give the money to Aharon Ubanov. Moshe was a shliach. We could perform the mitzvah Pidyon HaBen on the shliach. But then the Mariasad asks, we learn in Gittin Chov Gimel and Kiddushin Mem Aleph, a person cannot be a shliach to any act, to any deed, to any mitzvah which is not shaykh by himself. So an Eved cannot be a shliach leget because there is no gerushin by Eved Kanani. So Rabbi Yehuda Asad asks, could a Levi be a shliach lepidyon HaBen? Obviously, a Yisrael could be, because every Yisrael is chayiv in Pidyon HaBen if he has a firstborn son to his wife, Peter Rechem. Kohen could be a shliach because a Kohen is also part of the mitzvah. He gets the money. But a Levi neither is mechuyev to do Pidyon HaBen on his children, neither is he entitled to get the money. He's not on this side nor on that side. Can he still be a shliach? Rabbi Yehuda Asad says yes. Pidyon HaBen isnehu belevi, because the very first Pidyon HaBen, the Leviim were part of the mitzvah. And Moshe Rabbeinu was the shliach and he himself was a Levi. So I mentioned 5 halachas that we learn from this parsha. So let's get to the point. The Ramah says there is no shlichus by Pidyon HaBen. And the Ramah quotes Shuvas HaRivash in Mekuf Lamed Aleph. Many wonder. The Rivash says nothing about this. The Shoyal writes, that means the person that turned to Rivash, it is in his question that he assumes, as if it's a simple halacha, that a father cannot do Pidyon HaBen adei shliach. But the Rivash doesn't even respond to that assumption. He neither negates it nor embraces it. He just ignores it. So what is the weight and significance when we find a certain halacha, not in the tshuvas of our great gedolim, but in the questions that were presented to them, and these questions are printed in their sforim. But anyway, the Ramah says there is no shlichus by Pidyon HaBen. Almost all the Achronim disagree. The Bach, both the Taz and the Shach Sif Gut Nyon Aleph, Bir Agro, Machna Fraim, Hilchas Chiev, Metonis, and Zayin, Tshuvas Chasam Soifi, Yoredeya, Reish Tzadik Gimel, Reish Tzadik Zayin, Pischit Tshuva on the spot. Almost everyone disagrees. The Gra has 3 arguments against the Ramah. First of all, he says, even if we would need shlichus, we would say shlichus shalom kamoisha. There's no svara, no reason. Person cannot be poida benoi al yedei shaliach. Number 2, we don't even need shlichus because mitzvah sabed is just matnas kahuna. Do we need a shliach to send truma over to the Kohen's house, or meiser to a Levi, or Eishes Agez, or Zroya Lachayayim Vekeva? It's just like tzedakah. What do we need shlichus? It's matnos kahuna. And then the Gaon writes, argument number 3, Priyas Chayv. And the Gaon assumes, if I pay someone else's debt, I don't even need the consent of the lender, of the borrower. Reuven owes money to Shimon. Levi knows that Reuven is in a very, very bad financial state. And Levi offers Reuven, I'm going to pay the $10,000 you owe Shimon. And Reuven as a tzaddik says, I don't want you to pay it. I don't agree. I'm going to pay that money sooner or later. Levi goes directly to Shimon and he says, Reuven is a tzaddik. He doesn't want to take my support, but take the $10,000, and this is for Reuven's loan. Reuven doesn't need to pay, even though Reuven disagreed. When I pay someone's loan, that loan is nullified. It's paid whether the borrower agrees or not. So the Gaon says Pidyon HaBen is like paying a loan. We don't need shlichus. We don't even need the consent of the father. That's a big chiddush. So the Achronim deal with 2 different questions. According to the Gaon and the Machna Ephraim, we don't even need the consent of the father. According to the Pnei Yeshua and Kiddushin Daf Ches, Pri Chodesh, quoted in Ktsois Choshen Reish Mem Gimel, we don't even need the consent of the Kohen. A person could give 5 shkolim to a Kohen, whether he agrees to take it or not, and B'nai Podui. So these Gedolim assume Pidyon HaBen is all about Matnos Kohona, nothing more. And therefore, they disagree with the Ramo. We don't even need Shlichus. Needless to say, Shlichus would work. In my Sefer, Bava Kama Simalametes, once again in Minchas Osher Pashas Koyrech, I wrote at great length, Pidyon HaBen is Pidyon. It's more than just giving 5 shkolim to a Kohen. If a duyoy meben chodesh tivde, b'chor bonecho tivde. The Torah speaks about Pidyon, which is like a transaction. It is more than just a handout, giving a gift. The Rambam, mitzvahs asay pay, sefer mitzvahs, that is the mitzvah of Pidyon HaBen. The Rambam clearly writes, what is the essence of the mitzvah and how do we perform this mitzvah? So I just want to quote the Lashon of the Rambam because I think it's very significant. Ha-mitzvah shmoyne mitzvah shetzivonu livdois b'chorodom shenitan adome mahem lekoyen. V'bir lono hanasina zoisech tiyevahu שנבדהו מן הכהן, וכאילו הוא כבר זכה בו, ונקנהו הימנו בחומש סלוים. כאילו זכה בו. It is as if the Kohen owns the child, and we buy the child from the Kohen. Tshuvas Arivash, Kuf Lamed Aleph. He brings the Rosh. Perakama de Kedushin Simem Aleph. The Rosh brings that some places the minig is that the Kohen says a brocha as well. The father says berachas a mitzvah shekedushono b'mitzvos tzivonu, but the Kohen also says a brocha. And the Rosh writes in Tzarfat and in Ashkenaz that's not our minig. Why would the Kohen say a brocha? He's not part of the mitzvah. He just receives money. The recipient of matnas Kohen never says a brocha. Neither a Kohen receiving trumas nor a Levi receiving Maisa, nor an Oni that gets tzedakah. Why would a Kohen say a bracha? That's the opinion of the Rosh. So maybe the Rosh proves the point of the Gon and the Machar Ephraim and others. But the Rivash disagrees. And I'm reading the Lashon of the Rivash. She'alto lamo tiknu bracha lekohen bepidyon yoisor mebishar matnis kohuna k'shezaricha behem. The Rivash explains, by other matnas kehuna, the Kohen is only a recipient, nothing more. However, by Pidyon HaBen, zocho beben v'noisnoi la'av b'pidyonoi. The Kohen has ownership of the child, and he gives the child to the father in exchange to the money. Now, the Rivash doesn't really mean that the Kohen owns the child. The Kohen doesn't own the child. Even the father doesn't own the child. A child, a human being, is never a possession. Parents don't own a child. They can't sell him. They don't own him. It's not a monetary ownership. But nevertheless, we cannot ignore the Lashon of the Rambam and the Rivash. It is as if. That is the formula of the mitzvah. Tshuvas Rashba Chelak Aleph Siman Yudches. Very famous Tshuvah that Rashba gives us certain rules and guidelines, which mitzvahs necessitate a brocha and which mitzvahs we do not say a brocha. So one of the asaidas that the Rashba writes, mitzvahs that are all about giving, we don't say a brocha. Whether it's tzedakah or gemilas chesodom or giving a loan or giving truma lekoyen, maser levi, maser oni. When it's all about giving, there is no brocha. So the Rashba asks, so why do we say a brocha on Pidyon HaBen? And the Rashba says, the brocha is on the Pidyon, not on the Nesinas HaKesef. So it's obvious from the Rashba there is something beyond giving money. There's something more to it. It's Pidyon, but we don't know what is this Pidyon. What is this essence? Sforno, one of the great commentators on Torah, the Sforno writes that a b'chor, a child, as long as we didn't do Pidyon HaBen, osar lahenis memenu, is like hegdish. And if this child grows up and he didn't do Pidyon HaBen, he wasn't redeemed, and a kohen didn't receive money in his exchange, he's osir b'hana, like a behemoth of hegdish. Now, the safana wasn't a poisik. This is definitely not correct in halachic criteria. It's not found in the Rambam or anywhere, neither in Chazal nor the Poskim. But there is something to it. Maybe it has to do more with Kabbalah, with Pnimius. But I brought Rambam, Rashba, Rivash. There is something more than giving money, and it's also obvious from the Sephora. So let us go one step forward. Is there any explanation in the Ramah that Shlichus doesn't apply to Pidyon HaBen? Levush, Shin Hei Sif Yud. The Levush was a Talmud of the Ramah. He usually follows in his footsteps, and the Levush writes, you can't do Shlichus by Pidyon HaBen because it's a mitzvah shebeguf like tefillin and tzitzis. To me, this is so hard to accept, almost impossible to accept, because I dealt at great length with these fundamental questions. Which mitzvahs does shlichus apply? Which mitzvahs doesn't shlichus apply? And fundamentally, what I explained is, there is no shlichus b'avodas Hashem. I want to tell you a ridiculous story. Person has a real struggle with emunah. He has a real struggle with emunah, lo aleinu. But he is afraid, so he makes a shliach to believe in a Kodesh Baruch Hu. He pays him money. You believe for me. Everybody listening to this stupid story either smiles or wonders, what is he talking about? And you're right. So a person had tremendous suffering, and he fell. He doesn't love a Kodesh Baruch Hu, so he makes a shliach la'avas Hashem. This is just ridiculous. You can't make a shliach to Amunah, to Ava, to Yura, and I say, it is just as simple, just as poshut. You can't make a shliach to any mitzvah that is essentially avodas Elokim in its purity. Just like you can't make a shliach la'av or le'yira, le'amunah sayichud, you can't make a shliach to tefillah, to brochos, to kriya shema, to matzah or moror, sukkah or lulav. Shlichus is only relevant. It only applies to mitzvahs which are about the result, about the outcome. And therefore, Pidyon HaBen is about the result. Money goes to the kohen, your son, as if, comes into your possession. Tefillin and tzitzis are avodas ukeil. So let me share with you my interpretation, which is a chiddush. There is no shlichus by chalitza. And why is that? There is shlichus by get, by kedushin, not by chalitza. And that's a gemor ksubas ein dalad medalef yavom eskuvav medalef. Geoine Basroi, the great Rosh Hashivas, Rab Chaim, Hilchas Yibum, Shar Yoshar, Rab Elchanan in Yavom Eskuvav Kovitz Oros, have a profound explanation. And I will try to put it into simple words. In yeshivas, there's an expression which is widely used, a chalois. What is a chalois? A chalois is an act, a deed, which alters, changes, transforms the status, either of a person or of a thing. A thing, davar, a chefza. Kedushin and gerushin. The woman's status is transformed from a pnuya to an eishasish, from an eishasish to a pnuya. Kinyonim. The status of the money has changed. It belonged to Reuven, and now it's transferred to Shimon. Hafroshas to Mesamaisis. Perez or Tevel are Tevel no longer. Some of them are to Mesamaisis, and all the rest are permissible for consumption. That is what we call a chalois. Most chaloisim are an expression, a manifestation of a person's authority. I have the right to be makadosh, to be megarish, to marry, to divorce, to purchase, to sell. But there's another type of chalois, which is chalitza. It is not my authority or my power. It is the mitzvah. I just have a mitzvah of chalitza, and it's the koyach HaTorah, the gzeres because when this mitzvah is performed, the woman no longer is attached to her deceased husband's brother, and she is permissible for all. She could get married to anyone she chooses. But that is not the person's power, his authority. It is koyach HaTorah. How do we know? How do we know? I think it's very simple. All the kinyonim and every other chalois has some intrinsic logic. One of the famous shiurim I wrote and I spoke about a lot is Arba Avos B'Kinyonim. Each of the many complicated kinyonim has intrinsic, internal logic. Kinyan Kesef or Kinyan Chalufin. It is fundamentally reasonable that a person gives, he deserves to get something in exchange, and when he gets something, he's expected to pay for it. That's Kesef. Chotza. When you bring something into your possession and you have sole control, that is a reflection of Bailis, of Kinyan. Kesef Shtarabiyah. But Chalitza is a strange form of a chalois. She takes off his shoe, she spits on the floor, spitting, removing his shoe. That doesn't have any fundamental logic. What does it have to do with kinyonim? I want to make another point. Every chalois a person says, according to Chazal, he needs to express his desire. What am I doing and what do I want to achieve? Harei at mikudeshes li. By a get, it's harei at muteres lekol adam. Sodi machu lecha, lei chazak v'kni. Did you ever think, why doesn't the choletz say harei at muteres lekol adam? That is the formula of a get. No, the choletz says nothing. He says, lo chufatzti lakachta. And she says, me'en yevomi. And all the presents shout out, Beis Chalutz Hanal. He doesn't say that Materes because he is not the one that is Matir. It's not you. You just perform a mitzvah. And the results are automatic. Koyach HaTorah. And that is why there is no Shlichus B'Chalitza. Shlichus is delegating authority. I could appoint an agent and give him the authority to do this on my behalf. By Chalitza, it's not your authority. You have no authority to give over. All you do is a mitzvah. The results are from above. Koyach HaTorah. And that is why Ein Tanai B'Chalitza and Shlichus B'Chalitza. Let's go back to Pidyon HaBen. I argue there is something more to Pidyon HaBen than just giving money. We proved this from the Rambam, the Rashba, the Rivash, and in Minchas Osho Bava Kama and Pashas Koirech. There are many more rayas. But we don't know what is that result. There are two different halachas of Pidyon. Pidyon Hegdish and Pidyon Maaser Sheni. Pidyon Hegdish essentially is a kinyan. You pay money to the gizbar. The money becomes Hegdish, and whatever you purchase from the gizbar becomes chulin. That's a proper transaction. To the extent that Rashi, Bava Metzia Menvav, maintains that we learn Kinyan Kesef from Pidyon Hegdish, V'nosel Kesef V'kamloi, Kesef B'metaltel, and has no other source. However, we find Pidyon Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni is a machlokes a few times in Shas. Rameya says Momen Gavoyach, Achomer Momen Hediet. We paskin Momen Hediet. Maaser Sheni is yours. It belongs to no one else. Maaser Sheni has Kedusha. You need to take it up to Yerushalayim and eat in Yerushalayim. So we redeem the Maaser Sheni with money. Maisi Yoitzer Achurim, the money becomes Maaser Sheni, because you can't schlep a ton of fruit from distant places to Yerushalayim. They will rot on the way. So the Kedusha is transferred from the Peiros to money. When you arrive in Yerushalayim, you transfer it back. You take Moas Mashani, you buy food, and the food becomes Kodesh B'Kedushas Maaser Sheni. That's not a transaction. because Maser Sheni Mum and Baalim. But Pidyon HaBen is not relevant, doesn't fit in with either of these. This is not really a transaction. Your child doesn't belong to the Kohen, and he will never belong to you. It's also, it has no halachic ramification. There is no kedusha in the child before he's podui, and nothing happens nachar shepodi. But there is something which is not reflected in halachic ruling, something we don't really understand, and that is why that something, whatever it is not your authority. It's the koyach HaTorah, and that is why shlichus wouldn't apply. I tried to make this as clear and brief as possible. That is my interpretation of the Ramah, because there is no other. None of the Achronim comes up with a reasonable explanation why wouldn't shlichus apply to Pidyon HaBen. This week we'll read Parshas Bamidbar. If Chumash Vayikra is defined as Torah's Kohanim, one could say Chumash Bamidbar should be defined as Torah's Haleviyim. All the halachas and mitzvahs of Leviyim are in Chumash Bamidbar. And the Shiur we said today is about the Leviyim stepping in place of the Bechorim. Kedushas Halaviyim starts in Parshas Bamidbar. Many times I explained every Jewish home could be and should be a Mikdash Ma'at. And the way to turn every Jewish home into a Beis Mikdash is Torah, Avodah, Gemilas Chosodim, because the entirety of Avodas HaMikdash, Avodas HaKoyanim, is Menorah, Mizbeach, Shulchan. Menorah is Torah, Mizbeach, Avodah, Shulchan is Chesed. But the Beis Mikdash also had Leviyim, and they also had a significant role. There could be no Beis Mikdash without Leviyim. So obviously the Mikdash Ma'at also requires Avodas HaLeviyim. What is Avodas HaLeviyim? The Leviyim had two different duties, roles, Shoyarim and Mishorerim. The Leviyim were the gatekeepers. They opened the gates and they closed. And they were Shoymrei HaMikdash, Mesechet Tomid, Mesechet Midas. B'chof Alef Mekoymes HaLeviyim Mishamrim. They were Mishorerim. When a Korban Sibah was brought, they were the ones singing and playing music with instruments and vocals. Those are the two jobs of the Leviyim. Every Jewish home needs Shoyarim and Mishorerim. We need gatekeepers. We always needed them, today more than ever before. We need Shoyarim. We need gatekeepers. We need ones that could determine who comes in and who stays out. And even more important, what comes in and what stays out. Chinuch is such a challenge today. Our children were exposed to so many negative things. We wish we could avoid them. When I was young, when many of us were young, a child growing up in a frum family, he had a million hurdles to overcome if he wanted just to be exposed to a Devar Aveira. Where would a frum boy see a newspaper or be exposed to Chas v'Sholem, all the filth that's out there? But today, all he needs is a smartphone or a computer, and with one or two clicks, he's everywhere. And this is mortal danger. Sreifes neshama v'guf kayim. And I deal every day with young yeshiva boys that were exposed to pornography, to kfira, to minas, to apikoros, and it's awful. Yes, we need to build moats around our homes, but moats are not enough. It's not enough. Even the most high security prisons never guaranteed that people can't get out. You could tunnel under moats, you could scale the walls, you could breach walls. Moats and walls were never enough to prevent people from leaving or people from getting in. If we want to guard our children, if we don't want to lose our children, we need mishairarim. We need happy homes. The Kohanim were the ones that did the avodah. The Leviim were the ones that provided the simcha to the avodah. So avodas Leviim centers around Shomrei HaShorim and the mishairarim. It is only if our children will be exposed, will be inspired, will be infused with Simchas HaTorah and Simchas HaMitzvah, growing up in an environment of Simcha, of Kedusha, that we could really hope that they will follow in our footsteps. Every day in the morning we say Berachas HaTorah. Bracha number 1 is Berachas HaMitzvah, Shekedushonu b'mitzvosav. Bracha number 3 is Berachas HaShevach, Asher Bochar Bano, but between the two, there's Berachas HaTfilah, V'harevnu Hashem Elokeinu es divrei teraschu b'finu. And then we have another request. V'nihiyeh anachnu v'tzetzuenu, v'tzetzoi tzetzuenu. It is unusual. There are two different bakoshes in one bracha, and my feeling is these are not two distinct and different bakoshes. They're two sides of the same coin. It is only if V'harevnu Hashem Elokeinu es divrei teraschu b'finu, if we will experience the beauty of Torah and we will share it with our children, that we could really expect. V'nihiyeh anachnu v'tzetzuenu, v'tzetzoi tzetzuenu kulonu yoidei shemecha. That is my bracha to all of you. We should experience the beauty of Torah, the simcha of mitzvah, share it with our children, and you should all have so much nachas the kedusha. Have a beautiful Shabbos.